We have long been persistently led to believe that technical progress is a straight line, leading steadily from primitive steam boilers to modern complex electric cars. School textbooks and university lectures have built a neat picture of the world where every generation of technology is superior to the last. However, one only needs to carefully study the chronicles of the late 19th century for this perfect scheme to begin crumbling. The cities of that time, whether Paris, Buenos Aires, or Moscow, appear surprisingly clean, high-tech, and harmonious, sometimes surpassing the metropolises that appeared half a century later. Huge, heavy metal wagons, packed to the brim with passengers, moved through the streets of these cities. These multi-ton giants rushed along rails with enviable speed and smoothness. But the most striking thing about this movement is what was missing. There were no horses to pull such a load. There were no clouds of steam or black smoke, the inevitable companions of the coal engines of that era. And what is the most terrifying nightmare for traditional historians? The sky above these streets was absolutely clear. The urban landscape was completely devoid of that suffocating web of cables and wires that entangled the world in the 20th century. A logical question arises. What powered these giants? What force made them move if official science claims that the internal combustion engine was then only in its infancy, and large-scale electrification was just taking its first timid steps? This description of a reality that does not fit into accepted frameworks exposes one of the largest deceptions of the industrial era. We are talking about wireless trams and technologies that, by all appearances, were intentionally suppressed to create a dependence on oil resources. Official history tries to offer explanations that, upon closer inspection, look unconvincing, to put it mildly. They tell us it was just a horse-drawn tram, and the absence of horses is explained by chance or the peculiarities of photography. But in footage capturing transport in motion, where the silhouettes of passers-by are blurred, draft animals are simply not there. Another popular version says these were pneumatic trams running on compressed air or early experiments with electric batteries. However, before taking these claims on faith, it is worth turning to elementary physics and mathematical calculations, about which the academic world prefers to remain tactfully silent, because numbers are capable of destroying any beautiful legend. To move a wagon weighing 8 or 10 tons and drive it along a route tens of kilometers long requires colossal energy expenditure, which cannot be provided by the primitive technologies of that time. If we consider the version with batteries, often used as a shield by academic sources, we encounter an insurmountable technical contradiction. Batteries of the late 19th century were lead-acid structures with negligible capacity and enormous weight. To ensure the movement of a heavy tram, half of its useful volume would have to be occupied by batteries, turning the vehicle into a carrier of its own power source. Moreover, the charging time for such devices would exceed their operating time by 3 times, making such a system economically absurd and technically impossible for the mass, tight schedules recorded in archival documents. This would not be a working transport network, but an endless standstill waiting for a charge. A similar situation arises with the theory of pneumatic traction. Although compressed air systems did exist, their operation requires a gigantic infrastructure, traces of which are completely absent in the urban planning of the past. To run a pneumatic network, powerful compressor stations are needed to pump pressure up to hundreds of atmospheres. However, on detailed maps of cities of that era, such industrial objects are not found. Furthermore, the physics of the process cannot be cheated. Pneumatic engines inevitably cool down when air expands, becoming covered in frost and condensation, and the process itself is accompanied by loud noise and hissing. Memoirs of contemporaries, however, describe the movement of trams as surprisingly smooth and, most importantly, absolutely silent. No rumbling, no hissing of escaping air, no clouds of steam. Thus, by the process of elimination, we come to the conclusion that autonomous energy sources inside the wagon were absent. If the tram did not carry fuel with it, and did not receive it via wires from above, then the energy source was in the only place that remained in constant contact with the machine, right underneath it. The answer to the riddle of movement lies not only in the wagons themselves, but also in the roadbed, the complexity of which surpasses many modern highways. When analyzing the construction of rail tracks of that time, the excessive use of metal and the strange depth of the foundation are striking. Engineers built such a margin of safety and metal into these tracks that it seems completely excessive for a simple guide rail. One gets the impression that the rails perform the function not just of a road, but of a complex electrotechnical component. There is a well-founded hypothesis that the metal network of tracks served as a global ground or return circuit for a giant energy system, and energy was transmitted without contact. Official science reluctantly admits the existence of systems with ground-level power collection, claiming they were unreliable due to dirt and water. However, historical chronicles testify to the contrary. Trams ran uninterrupted during downpours, snowfalls, and on muddy roads. If we were talking about a primitive electrical contact, any short circuit from water would have instantly paralyzed traffic. The system's resilience to weather conditions indicates that the technology was fundamentally different. Those elements in the space between the rails, which are today mistaken for ordinary mechanical nodes, could actually have been induction coils or resonators built into the roadbed. The tram received energy through powerful electromagnetic induction, just as modern devices charge from wireless stations, but on an industrial scale. The road itself was the stator of a deployed electric motor, and the wagon simply interacted with the generated field. This brilliantly explains the absence of heavy engines inside the body and the incredible smoothness of the ride. However, if the energy came from below, from the tracks, how was it converted into thrust? The answer to this question forces us to look higher and carefully study those strange metal structures on the roofs, which for a long time were mistakenly considered decorative elements. If we lift our gaze from the rail tracks to the tops of these mysterious vehicles, an even more striking picture opens up, completely destroying habitual ideas about the development of technology. Museum plaques and official blueprints persistently assure us that the complex metal structures crowning the roofs of ancient wagons are merely decorative elements, ventilation systems, or primitive lightning rods. However, critical engineering analysis forces us to doubt the adequacy of such explanations. Why does a city tram, whose route runs among high stone buildings, need such massive and complex lightning protection systems? And why are ventilation grills made in the form of perfect spirals, spheres, and ornate combs, which with frightening accuracy repeat the diagrams of inductance coils and resonant circuits from radio engineering textbooks? What historians call decoration actually represents functional nodes of a highly complex energy circuit. These toppers, resembling cones and bowls, served as receiving antennas and capacitors tuned to capture ether energy. If we assume that the urban environment of that time was saturated with a modulated electromagnetic field, then the tram turned not just into a cart with a motor, but into a mobile resonator. It did not need to burn fuel or drag wires behind it, because it became part of a closed circuit between the ionosphere, or emitters on towers, and the Earth through the rail track. The vehicle literally floated in an energy flow, like a sailboat using the force of the wind, free, clean, and absolutely silent. It is this principle that explains one of the main mysteries of early tram construction: the absence of a visible power unit. Inside these wagons, it is impossible to find giant steam boilers or massive battery blocks capable of moving 10 tons of steel. The undercarriages look too delicate and light to house powerful electric motors of the late 19th century model. The solution lies in the fact that the engine was the wagon body itself. The entire structure worked as an induction coil, creating thrust through interaction with an external field. We are dealing with Tesla technologies realized in metal on an industrial scale, but disguised as ordinary urban transport. An even more serious challenge to the laws of physics is posed by the so-called imperials, double-decker trams that ran in many cities around the world. Imagine a narrow track, often less than a meter wide, and a tall, heavy machine on the upper deck of which sat dozens of passengers. According to elementary mechanics, the center of gravity of such a structure is critically high. At any turn or gust of side wind, such a wagon should inevitably tip over. However, they drove fast, smoothly, and entered steep turns without the slightest tilt. Official versions about a heavy bottom and ballast do not hold water. To compensate for the weight of the upper floor, the base would have to be cast entirely from lead, which would make the tram immovable. The only technical solution capable of ensuring the stability of such an unstable system is a gyroscope. A powerful flywheel stabilizer hidden in the platform kept the wagon in a vertical position despite gravity. But the production of gyroscopes requires the highest precision mechanics, perfect balancing, and enormous rotational speeds. Where could such technologies come from in an era when a hay cart harnessed to a horse was considered the pinnacle of mass transport? We are observing technology that was centuries ahead of the official level of civilization development of that period. Silent movement, lack of vibration, and instant but smooth braking, described by eyewitnesses, is possible only when using electromagnetic fields or inertia control. These devices clearly did not correspond to the level of development of people in simple work robes shown in old photos with shovels in their hands. And here we come to a frightening question. Could these people have built what they were riding on at all? Official history insists that at the end of the 19th century, the world was swept by a sudden and inexplicable boom in tram construction. As if by the wave of a magic wand, thousands of kilometers of steel tracks began to appear simultaneously in hundreds of cities around the globe, from remote New Zealand to the expanses of the Russian Empire. However, if we compare this phenomenon with the real production capacities of the metallurgy of that period, an insoluble contradiction arises that destroys the usual chronology. Industry was then only transitioning from cast iron to steel, and the Bessemer process was just gaining momentum. The production of high-quality steel remained an incredibly expensive, labor-intensive, and limited process. Nevertheless, we are faced with the fact of total coverage of cities with a rail network. Tracks go far beyond the horizon, penetrate residential areas, connect industrial zones, and even neighboring cities. If we believe official reports on factory productivity, then to manufacture such a colossal amount of metal would require decades of continuous operation of all the smelting furnaces of the world. Mathematics is powerless here. It is impossible to produce millions of tons of products in factories that do not yet exist. The only logical explanation is that these tracks were not produced or laid in the 19th century. They were simply dug up. When analyzing archival materials documenting the so-called construction, the strange nature of the work strikes the eye. Instead of a complex engineering process with the laying of a cushion, gravel, and sleepers, we observe people with primitive shovels clearing away centuries-old layers of dirt and clay. They are not building a new road. They are clearing an existing, perfectly even rail track buried under a layer of soil. The workers look not like builders of a high-tech transport system, but like archaeologists uncovering the legacy of a previous, more developed civilization that perished as a result of a global catastrophe in the mid-19th century. This also explains the fact that the gauge all over the world initially had unified standards, which only later began to be chaotically remade to fit different national sizes. The original network was a single global system. Another confirmation of this theory is the demographic paradox. Panoramic views of cities of that time demonstrate the widest avenues, majestic architecture, and giant cathedrals designed for millions of residents. but the streets are frighteningly empty. In cities built with imperial scope, only tens of thousands of people live. Why drag a complex transport network to remote areas where no one lives? Why run routes with a 5-minute interval if the wagons run absolutely empty? The answer scares with its simplicity. The transport system worked in automatic mode. It was launched long before new settlers moved into these cities, our ancestors, who were brought in to settle the ruins. The trams continued to run on old programmed schedules, just as blood continues to circulate in a body that is in a coma. People in dirty robes and caps captured on the streets look completely alien against the backdrop of antique facades and futuristic transport. They are not the creators of this world. They are new tenants trying to adapt divine technologies to their primitive needs, exploiting what they cannot fully understand. We arrived at a ready-made table, but the new masters of the world did not possess the knowledge to manage this inheritance. Complex electronics and automation were inaccessible to them, which forced them to commit a barbaric intervention in the construction of the machines. To understand the scale of degradation, it is enough to carefully study the driver's seat. That is where the main physical evidence of the hack of high technology is located. Upon detailed study of the earliest chronicles, not yet subjected to retouching, a frightening discrepancy is discovered in the design of the so-called driver's workplace. On the nose of a high-tech wagon, where, according to all rules of ergonomics and safety, a protected cabin should be, there was often only a platform open to all winds. This engineering decision looks absurd if we assume that the control was originally intended to be manual. Try to imagine the working conditions of a human on such a platform in the severe winter of northern cities, be it St. Petersburg, Chicago, or Berlin. The operator had to stand motionless for 10 to 12 hours in the freezing cold, under an icy wind, the speed of which was amplified by the movement of the vehicle itself. Without a windshield, without a heat source, on a metal floor. From a physiological point of view, this is impossible. A person would get severe hypothermia or pneumonia after just a few days of such operation. Nevertheless, the chronicles record people in uniform gripping strange, crude levers and huge wheels that look like alien growths on the perfectly designed body of the tram. These primitive control elements, switches, mechanical brakes, were clearly bolted on at the very last moment, violating the integrity of the original design. Such disharmony serves as direct proof that, initially, these vehicles were unmanned. These were drones of a past era, working in complete harmony with the urban environment. The system functioned automatically, obeying the single rhythm of the electromagnetic network. Trams accelerated, braked, and maintained intervals, obeying field signals, not human will. A central processor or resonant frequency controlled the flow, eliminating the need for a gasket between the steering wheel and the seat. When the new owners of the cities seized this infrastructure, they faced a problem. The central control signal was lost or turned off. They could not restore the complex automation and were forced to switch the system to manual mode. It resembled a barbaric hack. Mechanical rods were cut into the delicate electronic filling. Controls were brought out to external platforms, and a human was put there, turning him into a forced biological machine. His task was merely to close and open the circuit, performing a function that a simple controller used to perform. Only later, realizing that the personnel physically could not withstand the cold, did they hastily begin to erect those angular, ugly birdhouse cabins on the open platforms, which clash so strongly with the elegant lines of the main salon. We observe traces of makeshift adaptation, where divine technology was crippled just to force it to serve the primitive needs of the new masters. However, even in such a mutilated, simplified, and hacked form, this transport system represented a colossal threat to the emerging energy market. Trams, albeit manually controlled, continued to remain too effective and, most importantly, frighteningly independent. They did not require coal, gasoline, or fuel oil on an industrial scale. which made their existence unbearable for those who planned to build their empire on the sale of combustible fuel. Free energy, even used at half capacity, was a nightmare for oil tycoons. The main enemy for the architects of the new financial system was not the complexity of ancient technologies itself, but their absolute, blatant gratuitousness. In a world built on principles of strict market exchange and capital accumulation, the existence of energy available to everyone, like air, was an unacceptable glitch in the matrix. Ether could not be packaged in barrels like oil or weighed on scales like coal. It could not be rationed for a specific consumer. If an electromagnetic field is generated by the infrastructure itself and is available along the entire length of the path, then it is impossible to install a meter on an individual wagon. You cannot bill for the use of space. It was this economic dead end that became the death sentence for wireless transport. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, a strange substitution of technologies occurs. Illogical from an engineering point of view, but absolutely justified financially. Suddenly, as if obeying an invisible command from a single center, wires begin to be strung in all major cities of the world. The clear sky, which had been free for centuries, is covered with an ugly copper mesh. This was presented to the population as a great step forward, as long-awaited electrification. But in reality, it was de-electrification, a grandiose rollback. Humanity was forcibly transferred from advanced wireless technologies working on principles of resonance to a primitive wire needle. Beautiful autonomous wagons capable of drawing energy from the environment were sent for scrap, or mutilated by welding bulky pantograph current collectors to their roofs. The essence of this transformation lay entirely in control. A wire is a leash. It leads to a specific power plant that belongs to a specific corporation. Coal or oil is burned at the power plant, which is also sold by someone. Thus, free transport turned into a dependent consumer. If a tram is tied to a wire, you can finally put a meter on it. You can count kilowatts and issue a bill. It is during this period that the Rockefeller Empire flourishes, the Federal Reserve System is created, and the global oil fever begins. These events do not coincidentally coincide in time with the disappearance of wireless traction. Bankers and industrialists needed to sell a resource, not give it away. They needed an eternal payer, an eternal slave of the system. The creation of the wire network was only the first stage of enslavement. It allowed public transport to be monetized, making it part of the market economy. But even in such a truncated, wired form, the tram remained too efficient and durable a mechanism. It was still more reliable and cheaper than internal combustion engines, which required a constant inflow of gasoline, oil, and spare parts. Therefore, when the technology was sufficiently simplified and brought under control, it turned out not to be enough. In the middle of the 20th century, the appetites of corporations grew so much that they decided trams, as a form of transport, must disappear physically. And then the real slaughter began. We have approached the darkest and most cynical stage of this historical tragedy. If previously we were talking about technological degradation and the intentional simplification of complex engineering systems, then the mid-20th century was marked by their physical extermination. This was not a natural dying out of an obsolete type of transport, as textbooks try to present to us. It was a planned execution, a large-scale purge carried out with cold calculation. In historical science, this crime was named the Great American Streetcar Scandal. But the geography of this process went far beyond the United States. As if by a single order from an invisible coordination center, cities around the world began to systematically destroy perfectly working transport networks. The scenario was the same everywhere and frighteningly effective. Buying companies appeared on the stage, behind whose faceless signs hid the capital of industrial giants. Car manufacturers, tire suppliers, and oil monopolists. Corporations like General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, through shell companies, began to mass purchase city tram depots. But the paradox was that capitalists spent millions of dollars not to develop the acquired asset or make a profit from transportation. They bought a competitor to kill it. Immediately after the deals were finalized, immediate dismantling began. This contradicted all laws of a healthy market, but fit perfectly into the strategy of total resource seizure. The process of destroying wagons resembled a barbarian invasion or a ritual sacrifice. Trams, many of which were in perfect technical condition and could serve for another half-century, were herded into giant wasteland dumps. They did not try to sell them to other cities or countries where transport was needed. They were not taken apart for spare parts. They were doused with gasoline and burned. The skeletons of hundreds of wagons, stretching beyond the horizon, turned into twisted scrap metal. They destroyed with a kind of maniacal hatred, as if these were not soulless machines, but living witnesses of a crime that had to be silenced forever. The main goal was to erase the very memory of reliable and durable transport, replacing it with a surrogate. Buses came to replace the eternal trams. Newspaper headlines shouted about progress and maneuverability, but reality turned out to be much more prosaic. Instead of a smooth ride on rails, passengers got shaking, smelly boxes with internal combustion engines. The service life of a bus was 5 times less than that of a tram, which was exactly what the manufacturers required. The tram was economically unprofitable for corporations, precisely because of its reliability. It broke down too rarely. The bus became the ideal consumer. It constantly required new tires from Firestone, liters of gasoline from Standard Oil, and spare parts from General Motors. We were driven into an endless cycle of consumption and repairs, calling it freedom of movement. But if wagons could be burned, the situation with the tracks was more complicated. Thousands of kilometers of high-quality steel did not disappear anywhere. It was too expensive and time-consuming to dig them out, so the new masters of life chose a simpler solution: to hide the evidence. We are literally walking and driving on the bones of an old civilization without even suspecting it. The fate of thousands of kilometers of steel mainlines remaining after the destruction of the wagons turned out to be no less dramatic than the fate of the trams themselves. In the vast majority of cities, the rails were not dismantled. This would have been too costly and lengthy an undertaking, capable of paralyzing the life of megacities for years. The new masters of the world chose a different solution, turning the streets into a giant sarcophagus. The tracks were simply rolled over with asphalt. Today, we literally walk and drive on the bones of an old, more developed civilization. Under a multi-layer pie of bitumen and gravel on the central avenues of New York, Paris, Melbourne, and Moscow, a giant metal network still rests. These are millions of tons of high-quality steel, which is now walled up alive. There is a theory that this act had not only a utilitarian, but also a deep physical meaning. If we consider the rail network as a giant grounding circuit and part of a planetary energy system, then covering it with a layer of asphalt, a powerful dielectric, became the final stage of blocking. By sealing the conductor in an insulator, the architects of the New World Order broke the chain. They effectively turned off the cities, turning an active medium capable of generating and transmitting energy into a passive, concrete desert. The cities stopped breathing ether, and the space, previously saturated with electrical potential, became dead. We live on ruins that we ourselves cemented, mistakenly believing that a layer of new asphalt is a sign of progress, whereas in reality, it is a seal of degradation. This destruction was not only technical in nature, it became a large-scale operation to change human consciousness. We were made to forget a fundamental truth. energy can be a gift, not a commodity. The implementation of the psychology of a consumer instead of the psychology of a creator was successful. Modern man considers it normal to pay for every kilowatt, stand in traffic jams, breathe exhaust gases, and spend his life servicing his free car. We were sold a surrogate of freedom, driven into financial slavery of insurance, loans, and gas receipts, having previously taken away free public transport that worked according to the laws of nature. The irony of fate lies in the fact that a century later, humanity is again trying to build light rail transport, spending billions to create what we already had, but in a much more perfect form. We are reinventing the wheel, looking at the blueprints of a spaceship, the meaning of which we no longer understand. Those old technologies, based on resonance and harmony with the planet, seem to be lost forever. Engineers who knew the secrets of tuning ether systems have disappeared, and documentation has turned to ash. We are left with only old photographs and a vague sense of anxiety, a genetic memory that cities should be different, quiet, clean, and swift. However, the past sometimes breaks through the imposed present. Every spring, when the snow melts and the asphalt begins to crack from temperature changes, rusty metal peeks out in deep potholes on the roads. These are old rails looking out, reminding us of the great deception and the incredible future that was stolen from us.